Hello everybody, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I would like to continue on the subject of JDBC template, a way to access the database that works as a wrapper over the JDBC. And I will talk about how to query, perform queries on the tables, but using parameters. And for that we'll be using, of course, JDBC template, but we'll compare with an alternative using NamedparameterJdbcTemplate. They work quite similar, but this one, the NamedparameterJdbcTemplate, allows you to explicitly declare the name of the parameters rather than using just question marks, as it is common when using JDBC or prepare statements in JDBC. There is also a third option, but it's not quietly a third option, which is BeanPropertySqlParameterSource. And you can see from the name, the parameter source is not related with JDBC template, but it's a way to pass a parameter to the NamedparameterJDBC template. So you can pass a Java class, a bean with properties, and the name of the properties would be the name of the parameters. So let's see some examples of how to implement this. So let's recap how JDBC template works. So if you want to use JDBC in Spring Boot, you just auto-wire, meaning you can inject directly JDBC template, and Spring Boot will try to find for you a data source that exists in its graph and inject automatically in JDBC template. Alternatively, you can do it manually by declaring a variable of the type JDBC template and you instantiate as a regular object, and you can inject a data source of your choice. Sometimes people ask me if I have the option to do auto-wire, why should I go manual? Sometimes we are working with legacy code, and we can't change the code for several reasons. Maybe there are unit tests or integration tests that can make it safe to refactor the code, and there are other reasons. So you should know both approach, because you never know when you will need it. Okay, so for the NamedparameterJDBC template, it's quite the same, but rather than use JDBC template as a variable, you just use NamedParameter. You only change this name, and the rest is completely equal. Remember that the only difference between NamedparameterJDBC template and the JDBC template, it's the way you can address the parameters of a query. So let's see some examples to understand both approach. So imagine that we want to query a table of users with a set of columns, and we want two parameters. One it's the role, and the other it's a boolean, say if it's active or not, the user. So one way to do it is just JDBC template query, and usually when we don't have parameters, just provide the query and the user row mapper, and this user row mapper, usually it is this code here. Okay, but we can refactor the code and put it in a private method, and we can reuse this mapper in other queries, because it's quite common to have at least two queries for the same table. One is to get based on a specific filter like this one, and sometimes we just want one user, but both will need this mapper. So rather than putting all this code here on the parameter of the query, we just refactor to a method, and we can reuse this user row mapper in any place, because at the end of the day, the data type that the query of JDBC template requires is the row mapper. So if you have a method that returns a row mapper, it will be okay for the JDBC template. So we provide the query here, and then we will provide an array of objects with a set of values that should follow the order that exists on the query, meaning that this admin here will be assigned to this first question mark, and the second parameter to the second question mark, and so on and so on. If you use that method in recent versions of the Spring Boot, you will find that this query with these parameters in this order is deprecated. That's the one way to work around that. If you don't want to use the deprecated method, is just ignore this second parameter. So use SQL here, use the row mapper, then a comma, and then you can put these values as parameters of the query if they are the last parameters of this method query. And that's one way to work around the deprecated, and it seems more modern. You just provide the query, provide the mapper, and then the parameters that will be assigned to these parameters of the query. Okay, that's a way to perform a query using parameters using JDBC template. If you use the named parameter JDBC template, in this case you can take advantage of the named, and in this case you can give a name to the parameter. It doesn't have to be the same as the colon. You can put whatever you want. It could be something like P1 and P2. It's the name that you choose. So, but in this case it makes sense to put role since the colon is role, and active since the colon is active here. Now you create a map with these names as keys and the values on the right. So it's a map of strings and objects. And now it's the same thing as the other query, but now you are using named parameter JDBC template query, and again we have the SQL, we have the parameters, which is this map, and the user row mapper, and again we have the row mapper here. So it's almost the same as JDBC template, but in this case you can give names. That's one way to do. So if we compare when we should choose one over the other, so this one uses positional, meaning that the position is important. So it's a kind of anonymous. We have to guess, and if we change the SQL somehow, it can have an impact on the area of the parameters or the parameters of the query, and we can start to have some bugs. Imagine that all the parameters are string, and if we change something in the query, the code still works, but the results will be unexpected. So there are more risk of creating bugs. Named parameter, since it uses names, the order, it's not important. If we change completely the query, but if the name of the parameters are there, it will fit the right parameters for the right order in this case. The JDBC template, it's not very readable because it's just question marks, and it doesn't say nothing about what will be the parameter. Of course, we can guess from the column name. And the named parameter, it's more readable, of course, than the JDBC template. Parameter mapping, use JDBC template, use an array of objects, but the recent implementations allow to be parameters of the query. So it's not only an array, but at the end of the day, they are just parameters on the query. The named parameter JDBC template can receive a map or even a bin, which will be the third option that I talk on our first slide. So, but I will see in a moment how to apply a bin on the parameters. So JDBC template doesn't support bin-based parameters, meaning it cannot accept an object that can be used as the properties for the parameters. You'll see in a moment what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's see the BeanPropertySqlParameterSource. So we are not talking about a different type of JDBC template. You can only find two. One is JDBC template, the other one it's NamedparameterJdbcTemplate template. These are the two types of JDBC template, at least the most popular ones. But now imagine that we are developing an application. We have a REST API that receives a set of parameters, and you set these parameters in an object that you'll pass as a parameter for later use them as a filter to the database. And let's call that object user search criteria. And they have a set of attributes. In our case, let's say you have a role and active. And rather than transform this object in a map, so we can use named parameter, we can use directly this class. How to do it? Okay, we just imagine that this is the way that we instantiate the user search criteria, for instance, coming from an API. Now we have to instantiate this object here, BeanPropertySqlParameterSource, and we pass as a parameter the bin with the attributes that we'll use as parameters. And now you can see that we are using a named parameter JDBC template like this. So we instantiate the named parameter JDBC template on the query, but here on the parameter, rather than passing a map, we pass this criteria here. The criteria is injected on the source. This source will be set this on the query of the named parameter JDBC template, because the criteria was injected first on the bin, and then this bin, I'm always looking at the bin because here is just a more high-level class, a parent class of this one. That's why we are using here the source. I mean, it's a bin property source. Because this is also a bin, that's why the confusion. But we inject the SqlParameterSource here, okay, based on a bin, and the bin is user search criteria. But at the end of the day, what we have is just two data types of JDBC template and the named parameter JDBC template, but the named JDBC template can receive a map, like here, okay, like this one, or a SqlParameterSource. And one of the instances that we can create and assign to this SqlParameterSource, it's a bin property, and of course we pass a bin with properties, which will be the role and active, which will be the names here, role and active. And by this time you already guessed the name of these properties, of course, should be the name of the parameters on the query. Okay. So as a summary, so method, we have JDBcTemplate with query. There are other methods. You have query by object. There are other methods, query for list and things like that. But we are talking only about query because it's the generic one. But I will address other methods in future videos. But for now, let's just focus on these parameters and select. So we have the JDBcTemplate query, and we have two ways to use the NamedparameterJdbcTemplate, again with a query. This one uses question mark, we already discussed that. Parameter source can be an array of objects or additional parameters on this query, at least the last parameters of the query. It's best for simple queries. Just a simple query, okay, get user by ID, get user by username and things like that. Usually it's enough because there is no problems of future change because it's only one parameter. We can guess easily which value it's assigned to that SQL string. For the named, we want to use the named when we have multiple parameters. For instance, we want to be sure that the names are the ones that we expect. And sometimes we have objects like the BeanPropertySqlParameterSource, where that we receive on API or from other system, and they already provides the names of the parameters. Of course, there is some discussion here because we are somehow coupling a string that is associated with a SQL that is used to query the database with an object that comes from the other side. What if I want to change the object? Now it breaks the query. So it's always, this is a solution that can be challenged. It's best, but at the same time, be careful because every time you create too much coupling in a system, there is always a big issue because if you have I couple between a system A and B, if you change A or B, there will be implications on the other system. So it's always a trade-off. So for me, usually, if you want my advice, if we just have one or two parameters, I would go with JDBcTemplate. Simple. If I have multiple ones, I will prefer to use the map because it's just strings, it's clear. If I have to change the name of the query, I can change the names of the map that it's local rather than change the bin. Of course, if I use the bin, it starts to break because it doesn't fit the parameter. So if I develop unit tests, maybe it's not a bad idea to use the BeanPropertySqlParameter. At the end of the day, choose the one that you feel more comfortable with. I will go probably for the middle one for multiple parameters. The first one for just one simple parameter. If I have a bin, you can also. What if you are receiving a bin? There are a lot of utilities that convert a bin quite fast and quite easily to a map. So, but okay, that's a discussion, just a question of taste at the end of the day. Okay, so final thoughts. Use JDBcTemplate for quick small queries. As I was saying, prefer NamedparameterJdbcTemplate for readability and flexibility. Use BeanProperty to keep code clean with DTOs. Yeah, the code will be clean, but sometimes when you clean too much the code, it creates coupling and can be a challenge, at least a management challenge. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you about the theory. Now let's see the practice of this. So in the practice, I refactor a little bit the code and I create an additional method here. Let's use the REST controller. Now we can query by users by ID because it's one parameter that we want to try, but I created an additional one so you can explore both options. One using the question mark and the other with the JDBcTemplate and the other one with the named parameter that I will use for username. At least for educational purpose. Of course, probably on the next lesson I will clean a little bit, just use one of the methods since I already explained how to use the other methods. But for now, that's what I'm trying to say. Sometimes I'm providing code that's, if you look into the quality, it's not good because for educational purpose, I have sometimes to duplicate and use different strategy at the same time on the same class. I don't like to use it in a production code for sure, but for educational purpose, so you have to excuse me for one or two videos until I refactor for the next one to have more clean code, let's say like that. So we have two APIs, one to get user by ID, the other to get user by username. I just use username here, and I don't have here because here on this ID, okay, if I use directly here username, there will be a conflict of address because at the end of the day will be user / and something. And there is no data type here, it's just a string. But of course, when injected here is integer, here is a string, and to avoid confusion, I create both. Of course, a different approach would be necessary if I really want to go to production like this. Maybe I should put this rather than using the path variable, maybe a request parameter, because I'm filtering now. I'm not targeting a specific user by ID, but I'm filtering a users by username. It's one way to decide when you should use path variable or request parameter. So this REST controller we call user service, of course, get by ID and get by username, but at the end of the day just call the repository for username and ID. So let's see what I did on the repository. So I have here AutoWire for JDBC template from the previous video, and for this video also I will use it to query the ID, and I injected here with AutoWire a named parameter JDBC template, and I still have the data source here because I have methods here to insert users, for instance, and update and delete that I'm still using data source. It's legacy code that I will refactor for future change and for future lessons, like for instance using JDBC to do inserts, updates and deletes. And when that time arrives, when that video is created, of course I'll remove the data source from here and we'll just use one of them, maybe this one or the named parameter, and the code will be cleaner. So let's see how to use the JDBC template. Here you can see that I'm creating a JDBC template like this, but I can remove it if I want. And it should work because the Spring will inject the data source in both JDBC template and this one, since we only have one data source. And it's not because it's injected here on this repository, but it will inject here data source because it's defining these application properties right here. And when Spring detects this in the properties, Spring data source, it will create a bin data source with this information. Of course, if you see my previous video, there are other ways to create these bins using bins manually with the notation bin. So let's return to our repository. So by ID, okay, let's where it is here. So get user by ID, we have this question mark, and before there was a lot of boilerplate code here with like this one with prepare statements and things like that. Now with JDBC template, the only thing that we want is just to since I'm returning an optional, I have JDBC template query for object rather than using query. It exists query for object because I only want one user. If it was a set of users, it's query, and we can do a parameter here, but I was not using. But we can create this query using a list if you put where ID something. But in that case, the query will return a list, and I should get the first row. But since I know that I just want one specific user, so I can use this query for object. I will address these methods in the future, but now I'm addressing now, at least you already know how to do it. When you want a list, use query. When we want a single object, you can use query for object. And in this case, it's SQL. Here it's the parameters, so that's what I said previously. We don't have to put parameters here. We can just put the parameters for this query here after the user row mapper. And of course, this user row mapper, you can see it here, is just a regular mapper. A lambda function with a result set, a row number, and here we instantiate user, okay, and we set based on the columns of the result set. Okay, it's the same as if we were applying it here. So the SQL, the row mapper, and the parameters, in our case it's only one, but if the query required more than one, we could just do something like this, username and so on. You can add parameters like this. So now we just return, it returns an optional, it returns a user or a null, and in this case we put optional of nullable, so we can return the optional user in case of the user is not found. When the user is not found and we are using query for object, that's one of the risks of using query for object, that if the user is not found, it throws an exception, an empty result.access exception, and in that case I'm returning an optional empty. One way to avoid this exception is to use the query. Since the query, the worst thing it can do is just to return 0 rows, but 0 rows is still a list. It's just a list without users, but it still works. But if you want to go more strict on your code, you should use the query for object. Okay, this is the old way. I put it here as a comment okay, query for object, where the parameters would be here in the middle. But this one is deprecated, so start to use this one, unless you are working with legacy code where this method doesn't exist yet. Okay, this is for the ID. For the username, it's a different way, but now I'm here doing the query with a named parameter. So I'm using here the named parameter JDBC template, and of course I have to create this map. So I create this map, I put the username, this username, it is this username. It's not the name of the column, it's the name of the parameter after this column here, and this is the parameter that we have here. And now it's named parameter JDBC template, query for object, SQL, again the parameters, which is this map here. If we have more than one, you just add additional keys and values. And again, the user row mapper. That's one other advantage of creating this, that you can reuse it in several methods, and the code will be cleaner. And again, since we are using query for object, again, if the user is not found, it will throw an empty result data set, and I will return an option empty. This empty will be necessary here, because when I detect that there is no user here, we just respond using the response entity as 404 or not found to the API. Okay, so you will see in your API 404, if you are in a browser, you will see a page saying not found. But of course, we are using sometimes a browser to do our tests, but we are using an API, not web pages. So it's, if you write a user that doesn't exist, you will see a page not found. It's not an error, it's just the API being truthful, saying, okay, I couldn't find your user. So that's the two approaches. I didn't put here the approach with the bin, but it will be very similar to this one. Here, named template. The only thing, it's on the parameter here, maybe you can pass a user or something, and rather than using a map, you have to instantiate the SqlParameterSource, and here, rather than use the params, you will use the SqlParameterSource, but it will be quite similar to this one. Okay, so let's play and see the result. Okay, I don't see any errors, so I will open a browser here. Okay, so first let's see the users, if our API is working. So we can see the users, we have a pretty print here. Now we have this user, let's say user 3, and let's start our JDBC template. So we'll put 1 here, and you can see, okay, this is the user 1 as expected, but I choose 3, I don't know why I wrote 1. 3, okay. So I have 3, and the other way was to use what's happening here. Okay, users, it's use the username, user, let's say 3 or 2. Let's change to another one, the 2 one, and you can see username is working with the named parameter as expected. Okay, if we try to write something that doesn't exist, it's not an error. It says that this localhost page can't be found because it's the browser. The browser expects to receive some HTML, JavaScript, but it's calling an API. But the protocol, it's the same. That's why it works. But it received as expected is 404. It's not an error. It's just the API working correctly and the browser responding accordingly. If you remember here on the REST controller, you can see when the username is not found, we have here response entity not found, and that's the value that we are sending to the browser, and that's why we see the not found. So this is what it was my plan to talk about JDBC template parameters. I think with this information you can already start to create multiple queries with multiple parameters, and you can even choose between 3 methods to use depending on the circumstance of your project. So I hope you like it. Thank you for watching. Promote my channel, subscribe, tell your friends, and thank you for being here.